Today, our guest is Will. Will, welcome. He's from SyndicateDAO and a lot of other things. I'll let him give a little brief introduction of himself, and yeah, we're just going to be jamming on DAOs and what Will's learned from his experience and all that stuff. So, welcome, Will.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's fantastic to be here. So I'm Will. I'm the co-founder of Syndicate. We help everyone set up investment DAOs. So at SyndicateDAO, you can set up an investment DAO in literally just a few minutes, and we care a ton about democratizing access to it. I've been involved in Ethereum since 2014. I've been involved in the DAO space since 2016 with the very first DAO, which didn't go too well, but was something that I invested in and was very appreciated the goals of. And then also was involved with Constitution DAO on the core team, helped them get through the compliance process and actually jump through all the hoops to place the bid at Sotheby's. And then in addition to that, started Adventure Gold, which is a in-game currency for the loot ecosystem that has an incredible team of community members working on it now. So can talk about anything related to investment DAOs, community DAOs, history of DAOs, you name it.
Hey, Will, it's nice to meet you. I'm excited for this conversation.
Absolutely. Great to meet you too today.
The first question I have is, how would you describe the distinction between an investment DAO and a community DAO?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the main distinction comes down to the expectation of profit. So in an investment DAO, you're putting funds in expecting to make money from it. Oftentimes, that implies that you also have ownership of the underlying assets. So you're putting money in specifically for a return, and usually you own what they're investing in, or at least are going to receive distributions from the treasury back to you as profits. For example, investment DAOs and Syndicate, the LAO, Flamingo, those would qualify. Protocols that distribute profits back to token holders, like Looks, for example, could also qualify as investment DAOs, though, of course, the compliance implications of something like Looks are very different than the compliance implications of a Syndicate DAO or Flamingo. And then community DAOs, on the other hand, don't have a profit motive. So you're putting in money or you're acquiring governance tokens because you believe in the DAO's mission, you want to further it, and what you essentially want is a voice. So, for example, one DAO we helped set up was Rug Radio. Rug Radio is a community DAO. People aren't putting money in with the expectation of profit. They're putting money in to help have a voice in how they choose to further the Rug Radio ecosystem. And all of their goal is to build like a better NFT community and help educate more people about NFTs. Another example of a community DAO would be, for example, like some of the life sciences DAOs that we see right now, where they're funding research, where even if you're not buying, say, rights to the IP and the underlying research, being able to decide what research is funded with a treasury is something that is very useful in and of its own. So a voice can be something that people desire, even if it doesn't tie back to profits, because having a say in the community can matter a lot in how the community succeeds, even if you're not receiving profits back.
Okay, that's really cool. What are the differences between, like you said, Syndicate and Flamingo, and what was there was another one that you...
Was the last
Looks, yeah. So what would be the things about Syndicate that make it less prone to running into compliance issues than the other one, than Looks?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So, so I'll give a quick overview of how these investment DAOs may be structured. So in the case of Syndicate, for example, we structure everything as investment clubs, which means you don't need to be an accredited investor. Anyone can put money in regardless of accreditation status. And it's very accessible. It's very, very easy to set up. So we use investment clubs as a structure, and that's because we want it to be as widely available as possible. The only downsides of investment clubs are, one, everyone has to vote, But voting can be very broadly defined. It's defined as active participation. So like a thumbs up in Discord could count. Saying yes in a group chat could count. It doesn't need to be a full governance vote with 100% participation. There's lots of things outside of the actual governance vote that could count as active participation. And then the second downside is that you can't publicly market them. But the upside is that it's incredibly easy to set up, and you don't have to be an accredited investor to join it. Flamingo and other DAOs structured under open laws structure, those are only accessible to high net worth individuals. So those are structured as venture funds. And the venture funds, you have to be an accredited investor. You have to prove that you have a net worth over $1 million or 250K in income. In some cases, a net worth over $2.1 million, depending on how fees are charged. But you can publicly market them. So to then sign up for them, you need to show bank statements, you need to show W-2s, you need to show a lot of personal financial information to sign up. But the upside is that you can have passive holders and you can publicly market it. So it's a lot more difficult to set up, but you can have passive holders, and it's essentially a venture fund is the structure that is used under the hood, the same as many other venture fund structures. So it's only accessible to a very small number of people, but those people have a slightly easier time in the governance process. The third category is things. So those two follow existing compliance structures pretty nicely. So they align really well with the existing laws. It's pretty clear how they're structured. There's a lot of regulatory clarity. It's not as unclear from a compliance perspective as other parts of crypto. There are things like Looks, for example, where Looks is distributing trading fees back to stakers. So OpenSea, for example, the trading fees go back to OpenSea as a corporation. With Looks, the trading fees goes back to Looks stakers. I won't comment specifically on the compliance implications of Looks beyond saying that it's extremely unclear and ambiguous, and something that I'd say is you'd want to have a lot of conversations with lawyers before you do something similar to what Looks does. So it has the most regulatory ambiguity. These things like staking structures where they're distributing profits back to any holder, those tend to have the most ambiguity from a regulatory perspective. People will still do it, of course, but it has a lot less clarity than the first two categories of investment clubs and venture funds.
I see. Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, one of the lines that gets drawn there is like if you are going to have people who aren't participating, putting money in and receiving returns, then they have to be accredited investors. But if you have a structure where any individual can participate, they can do so, but everybody has to participate. Otherwise, it steps into blurry territory. Am I correct?
Precisely, yeah, because one of the standard prongs of an analysis of whether something is a security, the prong that trips up most tokens is whether people have an expectation of profits based on the efforts of others. So essentially, are actions from other people causing us to make money, in which case it looks like a security, or your own actions causing this to make money. This is why investment clubs are not securities and why people don't need to be accredited to put money in. It's because everyone's actively participating, so there's no expectation of profits based on the efforts of others because everyone is contributing to the DAO. But in something like Looks, for example, where you're buying the token and then other people are trading, other people are building out the website, and you're just a passive holder, under a conservative reading, which would be that Looks would look more similar to like an investment in a startup, and like that typically requires only accredited investors. So yeah, the expectations of others provision that trips up most NFT projects or DAOs that cause them to be securities. This is also why like roadmaps and NFT projects can also like sometimes cause teams to run into trouble on this front. So like if you just release a drop of art or like some token gating primitive and say like this is available for anyone to use, probably there's no expectation of profits based on the efforts of others. It's just something you put out there. But if you say, and then we're going to do X, Y, Z, and we expect it to increase the token price for these reasons, then that starts to look more like a security. So, yeah, people have their own risk tolerances. But I'd say the things with teams building a ton of stuff for them and distributing those profits back to holders, or things that promise like really extensive roadmaps that talk about like a lot of things that they're going to build. Those tend to those would be things that have more gray areas on the regulatory side.
Got it. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the last bit that you were saying is one of the ways that people get tripped up with regulatory issues is where the expectation of profit comes from. So if you're buying it expecting not to have to do anything and receive a profit for it because other people are performing some ongoing effort to keep it going, then you're in securities territory. And if everybody who's profiting from it is participating in some way, then you can be in private club territory. And one of the things that I think people probably with, good intentions, but just lack of awareness are doing is writing roadmaps that, have ideas of things that they think that would be cool as far as rewards and stuff, but it ends up putting them in hot water from a regulatory standpoint when they go to execute on it, because if they actually did it, then they would be creating a security.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'd say that's a very a very good summary of it. And if anyone here is thinking about starting an NFT project or a DAO, definitely be careful about those issues. Those issues can create a lot of headache and hassle for you. There's many approaches that people are developing in the space to help reduce this. I think not promising a roadmap is one of the simplest things you can do, and then there's no expectation of anyone putting in work. And if you want to do surprise drops, you can do surprise drops. It's creating the expectation that you'll deliver on certain things that with a core team and without broader participation, that starts to look a little tricky. So if you want to save yourself a ton of headache on legal bills down the road, definitely be careful of these issues if you're starting your own project.
Man, this is awesome. This conversation for me it's exactly the next layer of information that I've been looking for as we've been putting together the DAO for Joe Shmoes. So this is so helpful. What are some of the most innovative and smooth operating voting processes that you've seen people set up, or how are the votes, how are the proposals set up? I'm curious what people are innovating in that kind of terrain, because I imagine it can be fairly complicated. Proposals can get complicated, and then there's a time barrier to reading them and digesting them and then casting a vote on them. Mm-hmm. Or is it more broken down than that? I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that every single DAO needs is the governance framework. Before they have any votes, they should have a governance framework. In the early days of Loot, we didn't have a governance framework initially, so people were posting votes that were in some cases impossible to execute. There would be multiple conflicting votes saying the opposite things that were winning at the same time. There is no criteria for how many people should vote, how long the vote should remain open, where discussions should take place. So the first thing you'll want is a governance framework. That governance framework typically lays out what the process is to go from idea to formal proposal. So MakerDAO has a great write-up of their governance framework. I'd highly recommend taking a look at that. And essentially, they it starts with a post on discussion forum. Some groups use Discord threads for this. And then from the discussion forum or the Discord thread, it moves to basically a signal vote, essentially like a vote that's just like really low key saying, hey, like toss a Discord emoji on this if you think this is a good idea, or like toss a vote on this forum post if you think it's a good idea. You don't need to sign anything. You don't need to log into your wallet. It's just meant to get a sense of like overall support. It's not meant to be used for the execution of the vote itself. And then the next stage is a snapshot vote where people are voting with their holdings. So Snapshot is compatible with both NFTs and ERC20 tokens, which is great, and it's super, super customizable, which helps a lot. So the snapshot vote, you do have to sign with your wallet, which essentially ensures that you actually hold the tokens, and that you're voting with your tokens. And then after the snapshot vote concludes, if it's multi-sig, the multi-sig will execute the results of that snapshot vote. And if it's an on-chain governance framework, which is necessary for larger protocol treasuries, less necessary for smaller DAOs, that vote will then be conducted again on-chain, and people vote on-chain and pay gas to do so. So a governance framework is really, really essential. Another thing that also more groups have been doing is vote delegation models. So Synthetics pioneered the model of a council, where you essentially elect representatives you want to represent you in these decisions, and they make decisions on behalf of the DAO. In some cases, if you don't like a decision from a representative, you can pull your vote back and vote on it directly, known as like a liquid democracy structure. And then also in some cases, there will be mechanisms where, for example, the longer you lock up your tokens, the more voting power you have, whether thinking that you're more aligned long-term with the DAO. And then there are some pure delegation models, like in ENS, for example, where you don't elect representatives. Instead, you just choose who you want to have your votes, and you could choose anyone to have your votes. These vote delegation models are nice because they offer a much wider range of voices. The downside of them, though, is that people typically don't redelegate, so they'll often a bunch of people delegated their votes to Coinbase, for example, and then Coinbase, I don't believe, has participated in like any votes. Maybe I could be wrong. I haven't tracked the NS governance super closely, but Coinbase definitely has not participated in some of the more contentious ENS votes. And then a lot of people don't redelegate their tokens, so as a result, like these kind of power structures get ossified and don't really change. So step one is you'll want a governance framework for sure, and then you'll also want to definitely look at vote delegation mechanisms. Every single person voting on every single thing also works, but it's a lot more messy. So definitely take a close look at that. One DAO that I think manages the like every person voting on everything aspect well is Juicebox. They're a crowdfunding portal, and they handle like treasury management, so you can like buy more tokens, get refunds of your tokens, things like that. We work with them for Constitution DAO, and they have everyone voting on everything, and sometimes the team will put forward a viewpoint and say what they think, and sometimes they'll lose those votes. Sometimes the team will win those votes. And it's a nice example of like this pure democracy because the team doesn't have any more sway than anyone else. They make their case to the community, and then the community decides. Of course, that's sometimes more messy, but that everyone voting on everything can work. It's just by far the most chaotic process out of the bunch.
Man, yeah, that brings up a whole nother set of terrain, because within whatever context that you're setting up the DAO in, you're probably going to want like a unique environment when it comes to voting proportions, and all of that stuff, because right, the more you need everybody to participate in every single decision, either the less complex operations the DAO can perform and the slower it is, or you like run into structural barriers when it comes to communication and so forth.
Yeah. And one model you start to see is sub DAOs. So for example, like there's cases where DAOs have been expected to vote on like individual team members' reimbursements for conference travel. And in a few cases, I believe there was one case in the Solana community. I don't remember which DAO it was off the top of my head. But like the community voted down reimbursing a team member for their travel to a conference. Even though the travel was pretty reasonable and they had already paid for it out of pocket to represent the DAO. One thing you'll start to see is like oftentimes people spin up sub DAOs where they might say, Uniswap grants as one example of a sub DAO or their DeFi education fund, where they might say, okay, great, we're going to carve out a portion of this money and give it to experts in this topic to manage. So, for example, with the DeFi Education Fund, like Uniswap governance voters they have expertise in how to allocate Uniswap's token, but they don't necessarily have expertise in like what the most effective regulatory lobbying methods are. So they basically said, we'll carve out a bunch of Uni tokens and we'll give that to the DeFi Education Fund, and the DeFi Education Fund can manage it as they see fit. In some cases, there's a provision where money can be taken away from sub-DAOs, or in some cases, the funding is milestone-based, so the sub-DAO needs to show progress to get more funding. But yeah, that was one thing they did. That ended up being quite controversial because, like the DeFi Education Fund had sold Uni tokens faster than people expected. They had like committed to one token signing schedule and then had sold them faster than they had stated at one point. So like the upside of sub-DAOs is that you delegate to people's expertise. The downside of sub-DAOs is that once you give them the funds, they are in their hands and they can choose to allocate it as they see fit. So it's a different level of trust. I'd say like council models, where people can still pull back their votes and vote on things directly. That has that requires less trust, whereas sub-DAOs where you're giving people the funds to manage, that requires a lot more trust. And sometimes that works really well and makes the DAO really nimble. Sometimes that doesn't work well. People do things the holders disagree with, then they're kind of stuck.
Based on what I'm hearing, it seems like there's probably a correlation with like the level of trust you're able to build with in the core team and the community, and speed, right? Because if you need it to be like an environment that requires less trust, then it might slow it down due to mechanics. But if it's a higher trust, it requires more trust. It's more risky if the trust fails, but it can move faster. Does that seem correct?
Yes, precisely. One thing I often say is that DAOs trade efficiency for resiliency. So I don't think DAOs will replace corporations. DAOs are a ton slower, a ton more chaotic, a ton more difficult to manage than a corporation. Corporations are often very top down. There's often centralized decision making, and they can move a lot faster as a result. But in sacrificing this efficiency, what you gain is resiliency. Like Facebook is pretty much entirely dependent on Mark Zuckerberg's decision making, for example, since I believe he does have voting control over Facebook. Whereas on a DAO, like you're not dependent on one person's decision making. Instead, the entire community can decide. So DAOs definitely are less efficient than traditional organizations. But the upside you get is that there's no single point of failure. You're not dependent on one person's decision. You can always change who's representing you. So this is why I think DAOs tend to work best for things with really, really clear-cut goals. So for example, like Constitution DAO, we had a really clear goal of we're going to try to buy the Constitution. If we win, we'll govern it, and we'll choose a place to display it and how we want to display it. And if we lose, we're going to just refund the money. And with investment DAOs, because they are profit oriented, the goal is pretty clear. The primary goal is make money. The secondary goal is invest in things that are good for the world, align with your values, etc. I think that these DAOs tend to work really well. And then the DAOs that can sometimes struggle more are the DAOs that look more like corporations that are trying to do really ambiguous creative work, in that case, it's a lot harder to make it be community driven. In Loot, for example, there were two different groups working on a revamped website for Loot, and neither of them knew that the other one was working on it. So one group finished their website, and then they told a bunch of people about it, and then the other group was like, "Oh, we actually already built it, and we're about to go live." So there were two people working on the same website without realizing it. There was also three different people I talked with who were building the first player versus player battle game for Loot, and they weren't coordinating their efforts because they didn't know that each other's efforts existed. So for these, in a corporation, that stuff wouldn't happen as easily. I mean, of course, it could still happen. Not all corporations are efficient, but on the whole, they tend to be more efficient than DAOs. So I think that DAOs are a really good fit when the use case and success criteria are really, really clear and people are super aligned. Less a good fit when it's more ambiguous. Uniswap kind of struggles with this ambiguity. Is the treasury meant to further Uniswap as a protocol? Is the treasury meant to increase the price of the Uni token? Or is the treasury meant to fund public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem? No one really has an answer to that. And as a result, the community's decisions can be very fragmented on some issues.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece too. The clarity and simplicity of the shared goal can make so much of a difference. Constitution DAO is a great example of that. But if it's ambiguous and shifting, then people come to their own conclusions, and then minds clash in decision making, and everything kind of grinds to a halt. But man, this has been such a rich kind of download and overview. Is so many little bits of information that I've been looking for that I feel like I found in this conversation. I am curious if Function's got anything to say after all of it, and or so far, and see who else in the audience maybe has questions, or because I'm sure there's a lot of questions coming up.
Yeah, I've just been sitting and absorbing. It was awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to have a Q&A. I mean, happy to share what I've seen with a bunch of different DAOs. Yeah, it's something that you only learn by doing, and not that many people have been involved in these projects and seen where they go right and where they go wrong. So yeah, happy to share my knowledge in any way. Fastly, you have a question?
Hey, Will. Fascinating discussion. Wondering what your views on the application of DAOs for managing governance on open source projects.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting one, because I think that the thing that DAOs are doing at the end of the day is managing a scarce resource. There are only so many tokens in a DAO's treasury, and they need to figure out how they want to spend them. Uni has 2.2 billion of Uniswap has 2.2 billion of Uni, and if they spend Uni on one thing, they can't spend it on other things. Open source is interesting because it doesn't have that same scarcity. Adding one feature doesn't reduce optionality for other features. Obviously, tech debt or certain architectural trade-offs can matter, but for the most part, being able to build an open source project is managing essentially something where you can keep adding features and keep having this abundance of them, instead of scarcity where adding one feature precludes your ability to add another feature. So I think that DAOs differ from open source from an asset management perspective, but I think DAOs are a really good tool for getting a pulse check on a community's views and their vision. And I think open source could really benefit from a structure that is similar. So if I were to set up a DAO for an open source project, I'd probably do it as an NFT where it gives people a voice. I probably wouldn't do it as a token because what you care about more is the membership of people who are really, really involved in it, and less about in an open source project. ideally it's one member equals one vote, where every user of the software has a similar voice. And maybe if a corporation is involved, they could buy more tokens, but you want to make membership very accessible, to get voices in from a lot of people. So I think that probably NFT projects or open source projects is something that's very interesting. Radical is doing a little bit on that front, where you can essentially put grant money you give to an open source project into an NFT, and the NFT then distributes out profits via their drips software. So I think that NFTs are fantastic for funding open source. I think that the governance of open source looks very different from the governance of DAOs that hold assets, because open source doesn't have the same scarcity as say Uniswap's treasury.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, because when the projects get over a certain size, especially when you have like kind of organizations using the open source and wanting to contribute, there's often that call for a kind of a project to have sort of a more impartial governance. And so one of the tricky decisions that open source projects will often have to make is whether they continue to build it in-house and maybe sort of slow down that rate of contribution, or donate the project to something like Linux Foundation or one of the other kind of open source foundations, which actually means kind of transferring the entire IP of the project, or at least the underlying ownership of the copyright to the foundation, which can be a very a big decision that's very hard to roll back. So this is a very interesting approach.
Definitely, yeah. I think DAOs are fantastic for these sorts of irreversible one-way decisions, because that's when you want the most voice and the most participation. I think that that's a really, really great use case for it. Absolutely. And I think NFTs and open source are particularly interesting and something that is pretty underexplored in the space.
Nice one. Thank you.
Absolutely. Beer DAO, you have anything you want to chat about?
Yeah. Love all the stuff you've done. Huge fan of DAOs, been in crypto for a while, been looking to kind of bridge the two, like real world and crypto. So kind of want to give you a high level overview.
Yeah. Do you have a specific question about DAOs or the DAO space?
Yeah. So we were looking to create like a buying co-op, and I was just wondering your thoughts on that process to create like a membership created buying co-op.
Yeah. So, the structure that people tend to use there is Colorado co-ops. There are a few extremely good Colorado co-op lawyers who are extremely stretched thin in terms of the requests that they get. I think that my impression, and I have not talked to any Colorado co-op lawyers yet, I've only talked with DAOs that have used the Colorado co-op structure, so this is all secondhand. And I'm scheduling calls with Colorado co-op lawyers to learn more about it, but take this as I heard this from someone who heard this from someone. Level of certainty is that I believe that the co-op structure allows you to give out refunds. So essentially, people can pay for memberships. You can then do like any activities you'd like, and then any excess funds available can be refunded back to members. So I think for a buying co-op, it could be a really good structure where people pool money to buy certain assets, and then if they end up over that threshold, then they can refund that money to individual people. We're exploring Colorado co-ops right now, but it's pretty early. So if you want to chat more about it, feel free to email me at will@SyndicateDAO. And once we get more of a clear understanding of the legal side, we can chat more about it in detail. I think that another structure you tend to see for community DAOs, in addition to co-ops, is UNAs, unincorporated nonprofit associations. Interestingly, those have a history with mostly Texas ranchers who would buy, for example, cattle together or grazing rights together or things along those lines. and unincorporated nonprofit associations don't have liability protection, and they do owe taxes because they're not registered nonprofits. They do owe federal taxes, but they are a really good structure for alignment among members. So UNAs are much more lightweight than co-op structures. And Jason Horowitz has this great paper about the unincorporated nonprofit association structure, why it matters, why they came to it as one of the ideal structures for DAOs. And we've also chatted with their team pretty extensively about it. So if you don't need liability protection as much, then UNAs can work very well also.
Thank you very much for the in-depth explanation. Yeah, I just was always thinking about an existing ecosystem and converting it into the Web3 space and allowing breweries to align, because cost of goods are rising so much and basically everyone's getting priced out. So it's allowing to create the buying structures, to allow, and then the membership aspect creates an ecosystem to the home brewers and the loyalty, brewers. Anyway, thank you very much.
I think both co-ops and UNAs are good structures here. They're kind of both have history for it, more in the context of like cattle ranching and things like that. But both of them align pretty well with your goals. Like group buying cattle looks pretty similar to group buying like other products or pooling money to get a better rate. And yeah, I think that one thing that's interesting about the DAO space in general is that a lot of these structures that DAOs are using have existed for a while. Investment clubs that Syndicate uses have existed for around 100 years. Unincorporated nonprofit associations have existed for decades. Co-ops have existed for centuries. A lot of these fund structures have existed for decades or centuries as well. But they're being applied in a really new way in the Web3 context. So one thing you'll see is like, usually there's examples of something, but the examples are kind of a little further away than what you typically expect. Like unincorporated nonprofit associations are pretty much homeowners associations and Texas ranchers as like the main groups that have used them. Co-ops, I mean, they are typically done on a really small local scale, and DAOs scale those up in a global way. Investment clubs used to be like people meeting together like once a month to talk about stock picks that they might do as a group, and now it's setting that up in minutes and voting as a group inside of group chats. So that's one thing you'll see as a recurring theme in the DAO space. A lot of these structures exist, and there's examples of them, but they're pretty different than what all of us are trying to do here. So you can usually find something similar to what you're trying to do, even if it's not a perfect match.
Thank you again. Yeah, I'd love to stay in touch and just to, continue to push the space. So thank you very much for all your time and effort.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm really appreciating the depth and clarity of your answers, and appreciating what you're highlighting there about the opportunity to be creative with some of these existing structures and Web3 applications to them.
Definitely.
Because some of them are relatively underused. Like there's not a lot of examples, like you said. So there's like a lot of room to be creative because there's not a lot of precedent set. They got set up a long time ago, and then a few people use them, but they're actually more conducive than some of the other structures that are more commonly used that have hierarchy kind of built into them by nature.
Yeah, totally. And that's the really exciting part is like everyone here who's working on DAOs. I know this is a very like conversation like in depth on like the nuts and bolts of how DAOs are structured and how DAOs are run, based on a lot of our experience at Syndicate, and my own personal experience in DAOs, for half a decade now. This is something where, all of us are inventing the standards together, which is really exciting. There's no like typical way things are done. Pretty much everything keeps getting reinvented over and over and over again, which with each improvement leading to something new. So I mean, like one thing that I think where this like innovation is most stark is airdrop mechanics. Like Uniswap pioneered the like surprise airdrop to people, and because they were the first ones to do it, they didn't run into too many issues with people trying to bot the airdrop because no one knew that it was coming. But then everyone who tried to do an airdrop style similar to Uniswap after that would get botted, and they'd have to like try to filter out the bots, or they'd have to just acknowledge that the bots existed. And sometimes those bots could have a really significant hit on the project by owning an outsized percentage of supply and taking it away from legitimate users of it. So then people need to constantly keep reinventing airdrop mechanisms. I think governance is something where we'll see this similar set of reinvention where governance, like direct governance has its benefits, it also has its problems, and we're kind of like speed running the history of political science and like governance theory right now, where we've already gone from direct democracy to like republics to liquid democracy, which is kind of an improvement on both, and something that I don't think any like government has implemented yet. So legal structures, like it's also constantly changing as there's more regulatory clarity. There's the various DAO laws that are introduced that have honestly pretty significant, there are significant steps forward in acknowledging the status of DAOs, but they are significant steps backwards in terms of regulatory clarity, for reasons that I can go into if people are interested in it. Like the Wyoming DAO law, for example, will automatically dissolve a DAO after 1 year of inactivity, but no one really knows what that 1 year of inactivity is. So as a result, like, is it any votes being passed within a year? Is it any votes being conducted within a year? Is it like any like transaction from the DAO? So like as a result, like, you know, if a Wyoming DAO exists for more than a year, no one really knows if it's still legally valid or not, because no one knows what the definition of inactivity is. So there's a lot of structures that we keep on coming up with on the fly that all help advance the space, because every new step is an improvement in understanding and an improvement in clarity.
Yeah. No, this is, I like how you said, speed running political science and the evolution of governance. You know, it is like that. The evolution is so rapid. I know I jumped kind of quick over to Q&A, so I'm curious if there's anything else that you had like front of mind that you wanted to share or feel like is relevant to close out this conversation.
I think that, yeah, essentially if anyone wants a guide to starting DAO, maybe at some point I should publish this, but right now it's just all in conversations. I think the first thing like that DAOs need is clarity of purpose. You should be as clear as possible on what the goal is and how the community should contribute. The more vague the DAO is, the harder it will be for your community members to contribute and collaborate with each other, and the more disjointed its outcomes will be. So the DAOs that have really, really broad, ambiguous goals tend to have more difficulties than DAOs with very clear and precise goals. And some DAOs, they don't even have a community in mind at all. And at the end of the day, a DAO is a community structure. So know who your community is and know what the goals are. And the clearer you are in both pieces, the more successful your DAO will be. Then from there, think about the tokenomics of the DAO. Like, what are you pursuing, and what incentives do you want to create? Not just what motivations you have in terms of the tokenomics of it, but also like the tokenomics are at the end of the day behavioral incentives. So if you, for example, govern your DAO via membership NFT, that looks more that has less liquidity and looks more like a long-term structure than, for example, a token. Are you going to have like lockup mechanisms? Are you going to have mechanisms where people get a larger say for the longer they agree to hold their DAO contributions for? So definitely look at what the tokenomics are and what kind of behavior you want to create, what kind of contributions you want people to make. And at Syndicate, we've intentionally designed DAO infrastructure to be very flexible for this. We know that groups often don't have the tokenomics figured out up front, so we provide DAO tooling for them that lets them figure it out as they go. Groups that set up on tools that are not made for DAO tooling often need to migrate off of that at like pretty extensive gas costs for their user base. So it can be very messy if you try to run a DAO on top of things that are not meant for DAOs. SyndicateDAO, for example, started on the OpenSea shared contract, and then that OpenSea took it down because they were doing real estate, and then they had to migrate to their own contract, and eventually OpenSea relisted them after that. But because they're on the shared contract, or any like shared NFT contracts in general, will make your life much, much more difficult. So try to avoid those for sure. And then the third thing after you figure out the tokenomics is figuring out the governance framework. So what assets does the DAO have, and how are you going to manage it? And what kind of governance framework will you use? Is it a council model, liquid democracy, direct democracy? Different options weight more towards vote delegation tends to benefit, tends to lead to more passive holders having a voice. Direct democracy tends to lead to more active holders having a voice, and it depends a lot on your DAO structure, whether you want to give more voice to passive holders or active holders. And then from there, those are most of the key pieces, and most of what DAOs need to get off the ground. There's a whole nother rabbit hole of legal and compliance structures, treasury management, asset allocation, whether you're going the community DAO route or the investment DAO route. Those are a ton of like more nuanced questions, but essentially like, who's your DAO for? What's the community? How will they contribute? What do the tokenomics look like? And what do the tokenomics look like? And then what does the governance framework look like? Covers like kind of the like essentials of your DAO as building blocks. Yeah, does anyone have any questions about those pieces or other things they want to dive into? I know that Mr. Zero X and Joe Dow and Benaware is yeah, cool. Mr. Zero X, yeah, he just unmuted. Nice.
Yep. I had a quick question. I find it really interesting, the topics around sort of having the primary goals and how the structure might reflect that. Have you seen cases where the structure of the DAO is like very fluid and dynamic depending on what the current high priority goals are, like where the structure actually changes over time?
Yeah, the most common ways we'll see DAOs change their structure over time is as they progressively decentralize. So oftentimes DAOs will start very centralized just by necessity, because before they have things figured out, they just do need some way to get things going. And that might be a few people on a core team working on things together. And then slowly they'll open up a broader community, add a Discord, and then once they have a strong community going, then they'll add a token, and then that will transition more to the community. So I think the key thing is how DAOs tend to go pretty heavily from centralized to decentralized. I haven't seen DAOs morph structures after being decentralized very often. One thing that is a good example of this is MakerDAO. They had a foundation that was centralized even after their token, and then they dissolved that, and they then became fully decentralized, where each then core working group, each core unit as they call it, which is kind of like delegating to specific teams with budgets and things like that. That they then became like the replacements for the foundation, and a lot of them ended up setting up their own corporate entities as core units. So it created more decentralization, but definitely sacrificed some efficiency. So I'd say some DAOs will dissolve their centralized entity after they have fully decentralized. Beyond that, you don't often see DAOs changing structures. I think that's actually one of the problems, is that once they have the initial tokenomics in place, it becomes very, very difficult to change. Some DAOs have successfully managed that, like Party DAO, for example. The core team had fewer tokens than people who just like happened to put a few ETH into their crowd fund. So like they managed to reconcile that. With Adventure Gold, we are also adjusting the tokenomics to create more alignment between Loot, mLoot, and Adventure Gold holders by adding in staking. So that way, there's alignment between these three communities instead of divergence between them. Yeah, I'd say that DAOs don't often change their structure once they're decentralized, which I think does more harm than good, honestly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Probably have time for two more questions if they're fast. MetaWares, you want to go ahead and then Jodo? Got it? Yeah, Jodo. Anything you want to talk about?
Yeah. Hi. Wow, this has been an awesome conversation, and I'm aware of the time. So, just quickly, one of the things that feels very relevant to this conversation is what decisions are best made at kind of what level of relationship within the DAO. It seems like there's kind of a sort of a concentric circle type of situation where you've got, core team, and you've got people who have specific expertise, and you've got people who are potentially more loyal because they're longer holders of governance tokens. And then you've got people who are further out in the community. You'd referenced in this conversation about how some decisions are better made, at the outer layers of that. For example, irreversible decisions make sense to get. You mentioned, more input on, and other decisions it makes sense to get people who have a greater level of expertise in a particular subject matter. And so I'm wondering if you've come across any examples where the DAOs are structured in those concentric circles in a way that is sort of proportionate to their influence, and that where that's been done particularly well, and is sort of like a good representation of that sort of trust matrix.
Yeah, so that's something where I think that there's a few different structures that are common for this. So there's a few things you might want to look at. One is holacracy. In the Web2 world, Zappos used holacracy, and the idea was like these circles for decision making that you may also very well already be familiar with it, given that the terms using align pretty well with holacracy, and it's a good fit for the DAO space. It's meant for like very decentralized, very flat organizations. In the Web2 world, it actually suffered because of some of the efficiency downsides, but in the Web3 world, I think it's a very, very good fit for DAOs. There's also a few options for structuring org charts of DAOs. Sobel is one example that lets you structure org charts. It's actually named after a character in the book Daemon, which is one of the original inspirations for DAOs and was referenced in the Ethereum white paper. Daemon by Daniel Suarez, the book Daemon. And then also, I think that Coordinate is a really, really good example of what you're looking for the nuts and bolts of running a DAO. So Coordinate has give circles where you can essentially different groups get different tokens, and they can allocate their tokens based on the work that people have done. And the cool part is that you can do this at the community-wide level, where people are giving tokens to each other as a whole community, or you can do it at the sub-DAO level as well. So individual teams can allocate how they want to divide up recognition of contributions. So yeah, I definitely say take a look at holacracy, Sobel, and Coordinate for these aspects, particularly for the management of DAOs, and to encode these relationships between different sub-DAOs and circles and groups.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been a fantastic time. Really love talking about the nuts and bolts of running a DAO. There's a lot of people talking about DAOs, very few people talking about running them. So it's fun to jam with everyone here on that. Function and Jedi, not sure if you have any closing words, but anyone here can email me at will@syndicate.io. the emails on my profile. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me because it's really easy for me to connect you to team members from there for the inquiries you might have. You can also message me on Twitter. I'm a bit slower to respond there, but you can also DM me as well.
Awesome, Will. Thank you, bro.
Will, thank you so much. This has been really an amazing conversation. I have appreciated. I feel like there's like a whole masterclass for creating a DAO in this recording. And also want to acknowledge Joe DAO as one of my co-authors for the Constitution that we're using over at Joe Shmoes right now. But that Constitution is part of a longer project where we study holacracy and all the flat organization structures that are out there and put together a governance structure. So appreciated how you noted at the beginning that like if you don't have the governance structure intact, then it can be really messy. So.
No, we'll just have to have you back on sometime, Will, and have another conversation. This has been awesome.
Very happy to. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll talk to you all soon. Anyone feel free to shoot me an email or reach out on Twitter if there's anything you want to chat about. Thanks so much.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.